Bougainville,
Keep it tight, man.
Solomon
Watch the flanks.
Islands,
Yes, sir.
January the
Keep pushing
30th,
forward. Roger that.
1944. Just past noon. The jungle is thick and the air is heavy with the smell of burning. Not the clean smell of wood smoke, the kind you remember from autumn bonfires back home. This is something else. Chemical. Petroleum. The unmistakable stench of war cooking the earth itself. A young American soldier is walking. He is 24 years old. He moves in a staggering line down a muddy trail that leads back toward the American perimeter, back toward safety, back toward the aid station where medics wait with morphine and bandages, and the quiet efficiency of men who have seen too many ruined bodies. His uniform is shredded. The olive drab fabric hangs from his shoulders in ribbons stained dark red. There is a bullet wound in his chest, severe and still bleeding, the kind of wound that should have put him flat on the ground an hour ago. But that is not the worst of it. His left eye is gone. The socket is an open wound, raw and terrible, and the blood from it has drawn a crooked line down the left side of his face like a river on a map that leads nowhere good. He is alone. No stretcher bearers carry him. No medic walks beside him. Nobody has an arm around his shoulder. He walks by himself, one foot in front of the other, through the steaming jungle of a Pacific island most Americans back home have never heard of. When he reaches the forward aid station, a young officer looks him over. The officer's eyes are not filled with concern. They are filled with anger. The officer speaks and his words are clipped and hard. Your squad had orders to hold the defensive perimeter. You left your position. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand the penalty for abandoning your post? But that officer does not know what this bleeding man has done. Does not know that he has just destroyed 2 enemy fortifications that every tank and every rifleman in the assault force had missed entirely. Does not know that his actions saved dozens of American lives. Does not know that what happened on this single afternoon will change the way the United States military fights across the entire Pacific theater. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Jesse Ray Drowley. And to understand how he ended up standing in front of that furious officer with one eye and a hole in his chest, we need to go back. Not just to the morning of this battle, much further than that. Back to a sawmill in Michigan, and the years when America was still trying to survive itself. If you or your father served in the Pacific during World War II, you will understand what these men went through. Before we go on, hit that subscribe button and tell us in the comments, did your family have a connection to the Solomon Islands campaign? Jesse Ray Drowley was born on September the 9th, 1919, in St. Charles, Michigan. He was the oldest of 6 children. His father, Sidney Drowley, was a sawmill worker. His mother, Mabel, whose maiden name was Sylvester, kept 6 children fed and clothed in a house that was never quite big enough and never quite warm enough in winter. The family called him Ray. Almost nobody used his first name until the Army got hold of him. St. Charles sits in Saginaw County, right in the heart of Michigan, a small farming town with wide streets and a church on every other corner. Sugar beet fields and soybean rows stretching flat to the horizon in every direction. The kind of town where everyone goes to church on Sunday, where your neighbor knows your dog's name, and where dinner most nights is mashed potatoes with beef stew because nobody can afford a proper steak. If you grew up in a town like that, you know exactly what it felt like. You know the rhythm of it, the way everybody works, nobody complains, and the measure of a man is not what he says, but what he does when there is work to be done. The Drowleys moved around Michigan chasing timber, chasing work, chasing whatever sawmill needed another strong back. Jesse grew up with the smell of wet sawdust in his clothes and the sound of diesel engines grinding through oak and pine every morning before sunrise. After high school, he walked into his father's sawmill and started working beside him. His hands learned the grain of hardwood and the weight of a crosscut saw long before they ever learned the weight of a rifle. Men like Jesse Drowley, men from small towns in the American heartland, did not talk much about feelings. They did not write poetry or make speeches. They expressed themselves through labor, through showing up, through the quiet, stubborn act of finishing whatever job was in front of them. That quality, that bone-deep belief that a man's worth is measured by what he does and not what he says, would follow Jesse Drowley all the way across the Pacific Ocean and into the most violent morning of his life. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. Every radio in every living room in America crackled with the news. The fleet was burning. The nation was in shock. Jesse, 22 years old, strong, healthy, the eldest son, wanted to enlist immediately. But Sidney Drowley looked at his boy and said something that stopped him cold. I need you here. The sawmill could not run without its strongest pair of hands. 5 younger brothers and sisters still needed feeding. The family needed the money. Jesse stayed. He stayed through 4 of the longest months of his life, listening to the radio every evening as the news got worse. Bataan fell. Corregidor fell. Singapore fell. The Japanese seemed unstoppable, and Jesse Drowley was cutting timber in Michigan. On April the 8th, 1942, he finally drove to Detroit and signed his enlistment papers at the recruiting station. When he left the sawmill for the last time, he shook his father's hand. Neither man said much of anything. A spring morning in Michigan, the smell of wet sawdust hanging in the air, the sound of sparrows outside. Sawmill men from Michigan do not express love in words. They express it by doing what needs to be done. Jesse Drowley carried that lesson with him to the other side of the world. He was assigned to the Americal Division, and here the story takes its first unusual turn. The Americal Division was unlike any other unit in the United States military during World War II. It was the only division that carried a name instead of a number. Formed on the island of New Caledonia in the South Pacific in May of 1942, its name was a combination of 2 words: American. New Caledonia, the Americal Division. It was officially redesignated as the 23rd Infantry Division later, but the name Americal stuck, and the men who served in it carried that name with a pride that surprised everyone, including themselves. The division was built from Orphan Regiment's National Guard units that had been separated from their parent divisions when the Army reorganized its structure. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, Jesse Drowley's regiment, came from the Illinois National Guard, originally part of the 33rd Infantry Division, before being detached. The 164th came from North Dakota. The 182nd from Massachusetts. These were not regular Army professionals. Before the war, these men were factory workers, farmers, mechanics, store clerks. They drilled on weekends and marched in parades on the 4th of July. Not one of them ever imagined they would fight in a tropical jungle on an island they could not find on a map. Among the older soldiers in Company B of the 132nd Infantry was a senior squad leader named Thomas McBride. The men called him Mac. He was 34 years old, nearly a decade older than most of the soldiers around him, and his face carried the early wrinkles of a man who had already seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. Mac was the son of a coal miner from Morgantown, West Virginia. His father had died in the mines, not from a cave-in or an explosion, but from black lung, the slow suffocation of silicosis that took 10 years to finish what the coal dust had started. Mac left Appalachia because he did not want to die the same way his father did. He joined the regular army before the war, one of the few professional soldiers in a unit filled with weekend guardsmen. Mac McBride was the kind of non-commissioned officer every unit needs. Not the man who leads the charge, but the man who keeps everything running when everything falls apart. He knew when to shoot and when to dig in, when to let the men rest, and when to push them forward. He taught Jesse Drowley the first real lesson of the battlefield, not with an order. With a sentence he repeated so often it became a kind of prayer. A man does what the moment asks, or he don't do nothing at all. He said it in a slow Appalachian drawl, and then he turned away and went back to checking his weapon. He never explained what it meant. He told Drowley he would figure it out when the time came. The time came sooner than anyone expected. In late 1942, the American Division was sent to Guadalcanal to relieve the exhausted 1st Marine Division. The 132nd Infantry Regiment landed in December, and Jesse Drowley stepped onto an island where Marines had been fighting and dying for 4 months. The battle was still raging. Guadalcanal was a 90-mile-long island in the Solomon Islands chain, deep in the tropical South Pacific. The jungle was so thick you could barely see the sky. Temperatures stayed above 90 degrees. The humidity was so relentless it rotted clothes on your back, raised rashes on your skin, and rusted weapons overnight. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes bred in every puddle. Tropical rainstorms turned the ground into a sucking mud that pulled at your boots with every step. And somewhere in that jungle, hidden behind layers of green, the Japanese had dug in. They had built bunkers, and they were waiting. Drowley and the 132nd Infantry faced the Battle of Mount Austin in January 1943. Mount Austin sat just 6 miles southwest of Henderson Field, the American airstrip that was the entire strategic reason for the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese had turned the hill into a fortress. Their defensive complex, which the Americans called the Gifu, was a network of reinforced log bunkers sunk into the earth hidden beneath the jungle canopy, each one supporting the others with overlapping fields of fire. American artillery pounded the position with thousands of 105mm shells. The effect was almost zero. The shells burst in the treetops or buried themselves in soft earth, and the bunkers beneath remained untouched. This was where Jesse Drowley, 23 years old, the son of a sawmill worker who had never fired a shot at another human being, watched his friends fall for the first time. The jungle was so dense that gunfire seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The enemy was invisible. Bullets snapped through leaves and thudded into tree trunks, and men dropped and you could not see who was shooting at you or where they were hiding. Drowley was wounded at Mount Austin. He received the Bronze Star for valor, but the medal mattered less than the lesson he carried away from that hill. The Japanese fought from inside their fortifications and conventional weapons could not reach them. Bullets bounced off the heavy logs. Artillery fell in the jungle without hitting anything. Bombs dropped from above exploded in the canopy, while the bunkers below barely shuddered. The only way to kill the men inside was to get close. Close enough to see the firing slits. Close enough to hear the enemy breathing. But getting that close usually meant dying. The lesson carved itself into Drowley's memory. There had to be a way to bring destruction right up to the mouth of a Japanese bunker without sacrificing the man who carried it. He did not know the answer yet, but he knew the problem. And that knowledge, purchased with blood on a hill called Mount Austin, would prove decisive exactly 12 months later on an island called Bougainville. After Guadalcanal, the American Division pulled back to the Fiji Islands for rest and training. Drowley recovered from his wounds, was promoted to staff sergeant, and became a squad leader. Mac McBride, who had been lightly wounded in the same fighting, sat next to him one evening in Fiji and said something Drowley would remember. Guadalcanal taught you how to survive. The next one will teach you how to fight. Now the story shifts. Because while Drowley was healing in Fiji and preparing for whatever came next, a different kind of battle was being fought. Not a battle against the Japanese. A battle against the most terrifying weapon in the American arsenal. A weapon that was killing the very men who carried it. When the United States entered World War II, it was already behind. Germany had been using flamethrowers since the First World War. The Flammenwerfer had poured fire into the trenches at Verdun and the Somme. Japan had developed the Type 93 and Type 100 flamethrowers and used them in China. America had almost no experience with the weapon at all. The military rushed to develop its own version. The result was the M1 flamethrower, which entered production in late 1941. On paper, it looked formidable. 2 gasoline cylinders strapped to the operator's back. A smaller tank of compressed nitrogen to push the fuel through the nozzle. A long wand with an ignition system at the tip. Total weight when fully loaded more than 60 pounds. That is roughly the weight of an 8-year-old child riding on your back through dense tropical jungle while people are shooting at you. On paper, the M1 could project a stream of burning fuel up to 20 yards. In practice, it was a machine that dealt death in every direction, including backward. The ignition system was the first nightmare. It relied on an electric spark or a small pilot flame to light the fuel stream as it left the nozzle. In laboratory conditions, it worked perfectly. In the damp, wind-whipped jungles of the Pacific, it was a catastrophe. Humidity corroded the electrical contacts. Wind blew out the pilot flame. Operators learned to carry Zippo lighters as backup. Picture this. A soldier crouching in front of a Japanese bunker, 60 pounds of gasoline on his back. Enemy bullets snapping past his ears, and he is hunched over trying to flick a cigarette lighter to ignite his own weapon because the official system has failed. Again. The pressure system was the second nightmare. The nitrogen tanks were weak, producing an inconsistent fuel flow. Sometimes the flamethrower sprayed a powerful stream at full range. Sometimes it dribbled out in a pathetic arc that fell short by 10 yards. In combat, that inconsistency could be fatal. You calculated your approach based on a 20-yard range. The fuel fell short at 10. And there you stood in the open carrying 60 pounds of useless equipment, with every Japanese rifle pointed at the only man on the battlefield foolish enough to announce his position with a jet of fire. The third nightmare was the worst of all. Fuel leaks. Gasoline seeped from fittings and connections, soaking into the operator's uniform, running down his back, pooling in the small of his spine. If the ignition system misfired, if a spark jumped the wrong way, the operator did not burn the enemy. The operator burned himself. There are documented cases of American flamethrower operators being consumed by their own weapons before they ever pulled the trigger. They died not from enemy fire, but from the very tool designed to protect them. And even when everything worked exactly as intended, the flamethrower operator was still the most visible, most vulnerable, most targeted man on any battlefield. 60 pounds on your back made you slow. 2 shiny metal cylinders made you conspicuous. And the moment you fired, the brilliant orange stream of burning fuel announced your exact position to every enemy soldier within 500 yards. The Japanese learned fast. Kill the flamethrower man first. Eliminate the fire, and the rest becomes manageable. Flame troopers became priority targets in every engagement they entered. They were slow-moving, easily spotted, and they carried their own funeral pyre on their backs. The M1 was used successfully in combat for the first time on Guadalcanal, January 15, 1943. A team of Marine engineers crawled to within 25 yards of a Japanese bunker line and burned out 3 positions during a full day of fighting. The Army's flamethrower actions the same day were less successful. The improved M1A1 version arrived in the South Pacific in August of 1943, along with training teams from the Chemical Warfare Service. The new model used thickened fuel for better range, but the ignition problems in humid tropical conditions remained stubbornly unsolved. Yet for all its flaws, for all its danger to the men who carried it, the flamethrower possessed one terrifying advantage that no other weapon in the American arsenal could match. Fire found every crack. It poured through firing slits and crawled into tunnels and filled the interior of bunkers with heat and smoke and suffocating flame. It consumed the oxygen inside. It raised the temperature beyond human endurance. It did not need to be accurate. It did not need to see its target. No matter how deep you hid, no matter how thick the logs above your head, the fire found you. The only problem was keeping the man who carried it alive long enough to use it. And that is exactly the problem that an unnamed officer in the 754th Tank Battalion decided to solve in the late summer of 1943 on the island of New Caledonia, with an idea so simple it seemed almost too obvious, and so difficult it nearly proved impossible. The answer was armor. If the flamethrower operator could not survive in the open, then put him inside a tank. Mount the flame weapon in an M3A1 Stuart light tank and let 20 millimeters of steel do what human flesh could not. Close the distance to the Japanese bunker, while shielding the crew from small arms fire. Official Army documents do not record the name of the officer who first proposed the idea, but some accounts point to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, the commander of the 754th Tank Battalion at the time. The idea sounded perfect. The reality was something else entirely. The Stuart was a light tank roughly 14 tons, armed with a 37mm cannon and machine guns. It was designed for reconnaissance, not for breaching fortified positions. But it had the one thing no flamethrower operator possessed: a steel shell. The proposal was to fire the M1A1 flamethrower through the small pistol ports on the turret of the Stuart. Simple, elegant, protected. Except the turret of the Stuart was barely large enough for its 2-man crew to operate in. Cramming a full-length flamethrower inside was like trying to fit a broomstick into a phone booth while 2 men were already standing in it. The flame gun was too long to maneuver in the confined space. The operator could not aim properly. The concept that looked so promising on paper was physically impossible inside the turret. But in July of 1943, the Battle of New Georgia proved that the need was desperate and the cost of failure was measured in American lives. Japanese forces on New Georgia had dug elaborate bunker systems deep into the jungle, and American infantry bled for weeks trying to crack them open. Engineers on New Caledonia went back to the drawing board and redesigned everything. They abandoned the turret entirely. Instead, they mounted the flamethrower in the bow position where the front machine gun normally sat. They shortened the M1A1 flame gun to fit the .30 caliber ball mount at the front of the hull. They placed the flame nozzle just below the bow machine gun, which remained in place. This was a critical design choice. Tracer ammunition from that machine gun could serve as a backup ignition source if the flamethrower's own igniter failed. 2 5-gallon fuel containers were installed inside the hull. One on the floor in front of the bow gunner's seat. One behind the seat replacing the normal .30 caliber ammunition storage. Total fuel capacity, 10 gallons. Total flame duration, approximately 20 seconds. The bow gunner who would operate this weapon sat in the most dangerous seat in the Pacific Theater. In front of him, a small opening in the hull. Behind him, 5 gallons of gasoline. Beneath him, 5 more gallons. He was encased in steel and surrounded by fuel. If an enemy round penetrated the armor or a Molotov cocktail splashed through a vent, the bow gunner would be the first to burn. One of the men assigned to that seat was a young private first class named Walt Kaminsky. He was 22 years old, small and wiry at 5 feet 6 inches and 140 pounds, which made him ideal for the cramped bow position where larger men could barely breathe. Walt was Polish-American, raised in the south side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father worked the floor at U.S. Steel. Walt grew up with the smell of molten metal, the same way Drowley grew up with the smell of sawdust. When he learned he would be operating the new flame weapon, he wrote a letter home. "They tell me I will be sitting between 2 cans of gasoline and shooting fire through a hole smaller than the kitchen window at Ma's house. If Pop asks, tell him I am fine." In October of 1943, a demonstration was held near Noumea, the capital of New Caledonia. Officers from the United States, Australia, and New Zealand gathered to watch the modified Stuart tank perform. The results were impressive. The stream of fire engulfed the target area in a wall of rolling flame that consumed everything it touched. But the limitations were obvious to everyone watching. 10 gallons of fuel, 20 seconds of fire, then silence, then a long drive back to refuel while the infantry waited without flame support. The plan was to have the flamethrower tanks ready for the November 1st landings on Bougainville. Major Reino Lehtinen assumed command of the 754th Tank Battalion in late October and led the forward detachment toward the island. But when the first wave of Marines hit the beaches on November the 1st, the flame tanks were not ready. The 3rd Marine Tank Battalion had received some of the modified Stuarts, but there is no evidence they were ever used during the Marine phase of the campaign. The weapon that was supposed to change everything arrived too late for the opening act. But the war did not wait. Bougainville was not just another island. It was a strategic key to the entire South Pacific. The island sat in the Solomon Islands chain close enough to Rabaul on New Britain to serve as a base for American fighter aircraft escorting bombers. Rabaul was the center of Japanese power in the region, a fortress of naval bases, airfields, and supply depots. The Allied strategy was not to assault Rabaul directly. The cost would have been staggering. Instead, the plan was to surround it, neutralize it with air power, and let it wither. Bougainville provided the perfect location, close enough to Rabaul for fighter cover, far enough away that Japanese artillery could not reach the new airfields. The Americans did not need to conquer the entire island. They needed a beachhead large enough to operate coastal airstrips, and they needed to hold it against whatever the Japanese threw at them. Vice Admiral William Halsey wanted the 3rd Marine Division for the upcoming New Ireland operation, so the Army's Americal Division was ordered to relieve the Marines on Bougainville. The Americal landed on Christmas Day, December the 25th, 1943. The 132nd Infantry Regiment took the far right flank of the perimeter facing the Torokina River. And on the other side of the river, the Japanese were building something. His name was Lieutenant Kenji Murakami. He was 28 years old, an officer in the 6th Company 2nd Battalion of the 4th South Seas Garrison, the unit responsible for defending this sector of the island. Murakami was the son of a schoolteacher from Nagoya. He had served in China before being transferred to this steaming mosquito-plagued island in the middle of the Pacific. Bougainville was nothing like China. In China, the Japanese army attacked. Here, they defended. Murakami's mission was simple and terrible. Hold. Hold as long as possible. Make the enemy pay the highest price imaginable for every yard of jungle. There would be no reinforcements. There would be no evacuation. He built his bunkers not to win, but to bleed. The fortification that the Americans would come to call the Hornet's Nest was Murakami's masterwork. It was a dense network of reinforced log bunkers stretching several hundred yards from the east bank of the Torokina River to the coastal village of Mavavia. Each bunker was constructed from coconut palm trunks and tropical hardwood logs, 8 to 12 inches in diameter, stacked in multiple layers and covered with thick earth. The tops were camouflaged with leaves, branches, and jungle debris so thoroughly that from 10 yards away, a bunker was nearly invisible. The firing slits were narrow, barely wide enough for a machine gun barrel, which limited the angle from which the Americans could return fire. But the true genius of the Hornet's Nest was not any single bunker. It was the system. Each position was designed to protect the positions beside it. The fields of fire overlapped and interlocked. Attack Bunker A and you were shot from bunkers B and C. Shift your assault to Bunker B and fire poured in from A and D. There was no safe side. There was no blind spot. Every approach was covered. Every angle was lethal. Artillery could not touch the Hornet's Nest because the triple canopy jungle hid every bunker from aerial observation. Bombers flew overhead and saw nothing but unbroken green. From the air, the Hornet's Nest looked exactly like every other patch of jungle on Bougainville. But beneath the leaves, dozens of bunkers waited machine guns loaded Japanese soldiers steady at their posts. Murakami looked at what he had built and believed it could not be broken. The Americans might have more men, more tanks, more aircraft, but none of that mattered if they could not see the target, could not reach the target, and had to pay in blood for every step closer. The Americans tried. On January the 20th, the 132nd Infantry launched its first attack toward the Hornet's Nest. It failed. On January the 25th, they attacked again. Some ground was gained, but the deep penetration toward Mavavia that the commanders wanted never materialized. Portable flamethrowers proved useful when they worked, but the operators were cut down by Japanese fire before they could get close enough to matter. Major General John Hodge, the commander of the American Division, made a decision. The next assault would use tanks, and this time, the tanks would carry fire. The flamethrower tanks that had missed the November landings were finally ready. The 754th Tank Battalion's forward detachment equipped with M3A1 Stuarts, including several of the modified flame tanks, was committed to the fight. Hodge and Colonel Joseph Bush, the commander of the 132nd Infantry Regiment, were so confident in the combined power of artillery preparation and armored flame support that they called the upcoming operation a pushover. A pushover. They brought reporters and photographers to document the easy victory. Senior officers, including Hodge himself, planned to observe from close behind the advancing tanks. It was going to be a showcase, a demonstration of American firepower against a stubborn but doomed Japanese position. The night before the attack, Jesse Drowley sat in his foxhole in the Company B perimeter, cleaning his M1 Garand rifle by the fading light. His unit was not part of the assault force. Company B had been assigned to hold the defensive line and serve as a reserve. His orders were explicit. Do not leave your position. Do not engage the enemy. If Company C, the assault company, needed reinforcement, the call would come through proper channels. Until then, stay put. In the foxhole beside him, Mac McBride lay with his eyes open, watching the jungle canopy darken overhead. McBride rarely slept the night before a fight. He had been through Guadalcanal. He had been through Mount Austin. He had seen enough easy operations turn into nightmares to know that the word pushover was a dangerous thing to say out loud. Drowley asked him what he thought about tomorrow. McBride was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the artillery will fire, and the tanks will roll, and the Japanese will still be there when the smoke clears." Another silence. Insects screaming in the tropical night. The wet heat pressing down like a blanket. Then McBride spoke again, softer this time, in that slow Appalachian voice. "A man does what the moment asks, Ray." He called Drowley by his childhood name, the name his family used, the name from the sawmill and the small town and the mashed potatoes with beef stew. Then McBride rolled over and said nothing else. The moment was coming. And Jesse Drowley did not know it yet, but by the time the sun reached its peak the next day, he would understand exactly what that sentence meant. The morning of January the 30th, 1944 arrived the way mornings always arrive in the tropics. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone throwing open a furnace door. One moment the jungle was dark. The next it was sweltering and loud with the shrieking of insects and the dripping of moisture from a million leaves. At 0700 hours, Company C of the 132nd Infantry began moving toward the line of departure. Young men checked their weapons for the last time. The metallic sounds of preparation filled the heavy air. 8-round clips snapping into M1 Garand receivers. Bayonets tested against sheaths. Canteen caps tightened. Chin straps cinched. The small rituals that soldiers perform not because they change anything, but because doing something with your hands is better than doing nothing with your fear. Among them was Private First Class Ray Novak, 20 years old, walking in the skirmish line of the 3rd Platoon. He was Czech-American, raised in the back of the yards neighborhood of Chicago, a place named for exactly what it was, the streets behind the cattle pens of the Union stockyards. His father spent 10 hours a day on the cold floor of the Swift and Company meatpacking plant cutting beef so that America could eat. Novak had joined the Illinois National Guard before the war, because his friends did, and because the extra pay was not nothing. He never once imagined he would be standing in a tropical jungle with a loaded rifle waiting for the order to advance toward a fortified Japanese position. Novak looked around and noticed something unusual. Reporters, photographers with their cameras ready. Senior officers standing behind the line with binoculars as though they were about to watch a football game from the bleachers. The whole scene had the strange energy of a performance rather than a battle. Somebody up the chain had called this a pushover. Novak did not know what a pushover looked like, but he thought it probably did not involve this many cameras. Inside one of the M3A1 Stuart light tanks at the head of the column, Walt Kaminsky sat in the bow gunner's position, wedged into the tightest space in the Pacific Theater. The interior of the tank was already hot, the engine radiating heat through the steel floor, the air thick with the smell of machine oil and gasoline. Kaminsky could see the world outside only through a narrow observation slit, a rectangle of green jungle, no wider than a playing card, held at arm's length. Beside him, and beneath him, sat two 5-gallon canisters of flamethrower fuel. He checked the ignition system one more time, knowing it could fail at any moment, knowing that if it did, his 20 seconds of fire would become 20 seconds of wasted fuel spraying uselessly into the air. At 07:45, the bombardment began. The 4.2-inch smoke mortars of Company D 82nd Chemical Mortar Battalion opened fire first. White smoke billowed across the hornet's nest, a drifting curtain that masked the Japanese positions from view. The smoke hung low in the humid air, clinging to the treetops and filling the spaces between the trunks with a pale fog that smelled of phosphorus. Then the 81mm mortars joined in their rounds, thumping into the jungle with a steady rhythm that you could feel through your boots. At approximately 0800, the divisional artillery unleashed the main barrage. The ground shook. The trees shivered. Debris and dirt fountained upward from the Japanese line. Birds exploded from the canopy in screaming flocks. To the men watching from behind, to the reporters with their cameras, to the generals with their binoculars, it looked like nothing could survive that kind of punishment. It looked like the pushover they had been promised. They were wrong. Beneath the canopy, beneath the earth inside the heavy log walls of the hornet's nest, the Japanese waited. The shells fell in the treetops and buried themselves in soft ground and rattled the bunkers without breaking them. When the barrage lifted, the defenders were shaken but alive. Their machine guns still loaded their firing slits, still aimed at the approaches the Americans would have to cross. At 0830, the order came. Company C advanced in a skirmish line. 3rd Platoon on the right. 1st Platoon in the center. 2nd Platoon on the left. The Stuart tanks rolled forward at the head of the formation, their tracks grinding through the soft jungle floor, crushing roots and vegetation beneath 14 tons of American steel. Behind the tanks came the riflemen. Behind the riflemen came the demolition teams loaded with TNT and satchel charges tasked with finishing whatever the tanks and infantry started. For exactly 34 minutes, the advance proceeded according to plan. Then the first shell hit. It came at 0904. The sound was enormous, a shattering crack that split the morning apart. But the explosion did not come from the Japanese line. It came from behind. American artillery. A short round. Friendly fire. The shell struck one of the lead M3A1 Stuart tanks approximately 200 yards forward of the line of departure. The tank erupted in flames. The gasoline inside, including the flamethrower fuel, ignited instantly, and the Stuart became a pillar of fire in the middle of the jungle floor. Sergeant Minor J. Hall, the tank commander, was killed immediately. He never had a chance to react, never had a chance to call out, never had a chance to understand what had happened. One moment he was commanding his tank in an advance that was supposed to be easy. The next moment he was gone. 2 other crewmen were badly wounded, trapped near the burning wreckage. Corporal Joe Simon managed to escape the inferno. He pulled himself free of the blazing hull and rolled onto the jungle floor. Alive, breathing, his uniform scorched. He looked back and saw his wounded crewmates lying near the burning tank. They were exposed. Japanese small arms fire was already pouring into the area, the defenders in the hornet's nest seizing the opportunity to punish the stalled Americans. Every bullet that cracked past was aimed at the men near that burning Stuart. Simon made a choice. He turned around and ran back toward the wounded. He ran toward the fire and the bullets and the screaming metal. He reached for his crewmates, and the Japanese shot him down. Corporal Joe Simon died trying to rescue the men he had just escaped alongside. He was later awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He was not the last man to die that morning because of a decision made not by the enemy, but by his own side. Friendly fire, the worst 2 words in any soldier's vocabulary. If this story is hitting close to home, share it with someone who served. And if you are watching this far, you are part of something. Drop a comment telling us where your father or grandfather served in the Pacific. 200 yards away in the foxholes of Company B's defensive perimeter. Staff Sergeant Jesse Drowley watched it all happen. He saw the shell hit the tank. He saw it burn. He saw Hall die. He saw Simon climb out, turn back and fall. He saw 3 wounded Americans lying in the open bleeding, unable to move with Japanese bullets chewing the ground around them. No one from the assault force could reach them. The fire was too heavy. The distance was too exposed. The wounded men were going to die in the dirt between the American line and the hornet's nest unless someone did something. Drowley's orders were clear. Hold the perimeter. Stay in reserve. Do not engage. He looked at the wounded men. He looked at the burning tank. He looked at the space between the open ground swept by enemy fire where Joe Simon had just been killed. And Jesse Drowley left his foxhole. No one ordered him to move. No one gave permission. His commanding officer had told him in plain language to stay put. The rules of military discipline were absolute. Abandoning a defensive position during a combat operation was a court-martial offense. Drowley knew this. He had been in the army long enough to understand the consequences. He went anyway. He ran into the open ground under Japanese fire. Bullets snapped past him, that sharp, dry crack that sounds nothing like the movies, more like a whip breaking the air apart inches from your head. He reached the first wounded man, grabbed him by the collar, and dragged him back to cover. The man was heavy with gear and blood, and Drowley's boots slipped in the mud, but he kept pulling until they were both behind a fallen tree. Then he turned around and went back. Back across the same open ground. Back through the same Japanese fire. He reached the second wounded man, took hold of him, and hauled him to safety. 2 trips across open ground. 2 lives pulled from the killing zone. Any one of the dozens of Japanese bullets snapping through that space could have ended him. None of them did. Not yet. He started back a 3rd time. But this time he handed the rescue of the 3rd man to another soldier in his squad. Because during those frantic minutes of running and dragging and dodging, while his body was focused on saving the wounded, his eyes had seen something else. Something none of the tanks had noticed. Something none of the riflemen had spotted. Something that the 2 senior officers who were about to walk forward to observe the easy victory would never live long enough to see. But that discovery would have to wait. Because the battle was still unfolding, and the dying was not over. Company C continued its advance. The 1st platoon reached its objective at 0933. The 2nd platoon arrived at its position at 0940. The tanks halted, and the infantry took up defensive positions roughly 10 yards in front of them. For a brief moment, it looked as though the assault might be recovering from the disaster of the friendly fire. Then the observers moved forward. Colonel James Greer, the executive officer of the entire 132nd Infantry Regiment, the 2nd most senior officer in the regiment after Colonel Bush himself, decided to advance behind the tanks for a closer look. Beside him walked Lieutenant Colonel Donald Matheson, an Australian military observer who had come to Bougainville to study American infantry and armor tactics. These were experienced officers. Greer was responsible for the operational coordination of a full infantry regiment. Matheson had traveled from Australia to learn from the Americans. Both men moved toward the front because they believed the advance was proceeding well enough to observe safely. They had been told this would be a pushover. Japanese fire found them. Both Colonel James Greer and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Matheson were killed. The executive officer of the 132nd Infantry Regiment and an Allied observer from Australia dead on the jungle floor of Bougainville because they had walked forward into what their commanding general had called an easy fight. The pushover had now claimed a tank commander, a corporal who died rescuing his friends, and 2 senior officers who died trusting the optimism of their superiors. The morning was barely half over, and then the Japanese counterattacked. At approximately 10:30 hours, Japanese forces inside the hornet's nest launched a coordinated response. Molotov cocktails arced through the air toward the American tanks trailing fire. Mortar rounds began falling among the infantry positions. The assault, already staggered by friendly fire and the loss of senior leadership, now faced active resistance from an enemy that was far from beaten. 2nd Lieutenant John White, the commanding officer of the 2nd Platoon Company C, was leading his men behind the tanks when the counterattack struck. Mortar fragments and machine gun fire swept through his position. White was killed. Beside him, James Jarman, the acting platoon sergeant who had been filling in as the senior enlisted leader, fell at nearly the same moment. In a matter of seconds, the 2nd platoon lost both its officer and its senior non-commissioned officer. The platoon was leaderless. The men were pinned, and the hornet's nest was still shooting. There is something that happens in battle when things go wrong at every level. When the plan falls apart and the leadership falls and the casualties mount, and nothing works the way it was supposed to. Some men freeze, some men retreat, and some men do something that nobody expected, and that no regulation covers, and that no training prepares you for. From inside the hornet's nest, Lieutenant Kenji Murakami watched the American assault with the eyes of a professional soldier. He could see the tanks had stopped. He could see American bodies on the ground. He could see the officers falling. His bunker system was holding. The interlocking fields of fire were working exactly as designed. The flamethrower tanks had proven frightening but limited. 20 seconds of fuel, and then they had to withdraw to refuel. They were not fast enough. They were not powerful enough. And there was another problem that Murakami could observe even from inside his bunker. The American infantry and the American tanks could not communicate with each other. The riflemen waved and pointed, but the tanks buttoned up against small arms fire were nearly blind. The crews peered through narrow observation slits and could barely tell the difference between a Japanese bunker and an ordinary clump of jungle. The Americans had brought fire and steel, but they had forgotten to bring a way for the two to talk. What Murakami could not see was a single man running along the edge of the tree line, moving fast and low, heading not toward the rear, but toward one of the American tanks. A man who was not supposed to be there at all. Here is what Jesse Drowley had seen. While he was dragging those wounded soldiers to safety, while his hands were gripping fabric and his legs were pumping across open ground, his eyes had swept the battlefield the way a man with combat experience does, without thinking about it. And at the junction of the jungle edge and the beach near the position of the battered 2nd Platoon, he spotted something that every tank, every rifleman, and every officer in the assault force had missed. A Japanese pillbox, concealed in the vegetation where the tree line met the sand. Not on the main axis of attack. The tanks had advanced straight into the jungle and rolled right past it. The infantry had followed the tanks and never looked sideways. The observer group before they were killed had been focused on the front. But this pillbox was firing. Its machine gun was raking the flank of the American advance, pouring bullets into the 2nd Platoon's sector, inflicting heavy casualties from a direction nobody was watching. According to the official Medal of Honor citation, this position was a chief obstacle to the success of the advance. Drowley knew what a hidden pillbox meant. He had learned it on Guadalcanal on the slopes of Mount Austin in the blood-soaked jungle, where the Gifu fortifications had killed so many of his friends. A pillbox that nobody can see kills more men than a pillbox that everyone can see, because the men keep walking into the fire without knowing where it is coming from. He did not hesitate. He did not send a message through the regimental radio net. He did not request permission from his platoon leader. He did not follow protocol. His orders said, "Stay." He ran. Jesse Drowley broke from the tree line and sprinted across open ground toward a Stuart tank parked near the jungle edge. Japanese bullets snapped around him, that vicious dry crack of supersonic rounds passing close, the sound of air being torn apart. He ran low, zigzagging between fallen logs and shell craters, his M1 Garand clamped across his chest. He reached the tank. He climbed up onto the engine deck, the hot metal searing through his uniform where his knees pressed against it. And he took the butt of his M1 Garand rifle and hammered it against the turret hatch. Inside the tank, the crew heard the pounding. For a moment, they must have thought it was a Japanese soldier trying to pry open the hatch, but through the observation slit, they saw an American, mud-caked, sweat-drenched, blood on his uniform from the wounded men he had been dragging. His eyes were wild and focused, and his free hand was pointing furiously toward a spot in the vegetation that the crew had never noticed. The tank began to move in the direction Drowley indicated, but hand signals were not enough. The tank crew could barely see through their narrow viewing slits. They fired, but they fired at the wrong position. The rounds chewed up jungle that did not need chewing. The hidden pillbox continued to pour fire into the American flank. The crew understood the problem. They cracked the turret hatch just wide enough to pass out a submachine gun loaded with tracer ammunition. Tracer rounds contained a phosphorus compound in their base that burned bright as the bullet flew, drawing a visible line of orange light through the air. It was the only way to show the tank crew exactly where the target was hiding. Drowley took the submachine gun. He handed over his M1 Garand. In that small exchange of weapons, everything changed. He was no longer an infantryman holding a defensive position. He was no longer a squad leader following orders. He was now the eyes and the guiding hand of 14 tons of American armor. The M1 Garand that had been his personal weapon, the rifle he had cleaned the night before in his foxhole, the rifle he had used to bang on the turret to get the crew's attention, that rifle was gone. In his hands now was a tool of communication. Each burst of tracer would draw a burning orange finger through the humid air pointing at the enemy, saying, "Here, right here, this is where you aim." Drowley positioned himself on the engine deck of the tank. He was completely exposed. No cover, no armor plate between his body and the Japanese guns. He raised the submachine gun and fired toward the pillbox. The tracers streaked through the thick tropical air, bright orange lines cutting through the green, and inside the tank, the crew watched those glowing paths and understood. The tank lurched forward, tracks grinding, engine roaring. The Stuart began to close the distance to the pillbox. The Japanese inside that position and in the supporting bunkers recognized what was happening. They focused every weapon they had on the advancing tank and on the man riding its back. Rifle rounds, machine gun bursts. Everything aimed at the American who was sitting in the open on top of a moving target pointing a submachine gun at them and refusing to stop. The tank closed to within 20 feet of the pillbox. 20 feet. The length of a small living room. Close enough that Drowley could see the narrow firing slit in the bunker wall. Close enough to hear the bolt of the enemy machine gun cycling. Close enough that when the bullet hit him, he felt it before he heard it. A Japanese round punched through his chest. A severe wound, the kind that drops most men to the ground and keeps them there. Blood soaked through his uniform, immediately spreading dark and fast across the olive-drab fabric. Jesse Drowley did not stop. He did not climb down from the tank. He did not call for a medic. He did not turn back. The official Medal of Honor citation records what happened next in language that is almost impossibly understated. Refusing to return for medical treatment, he remained on the tank and continued to direct its progress until the enemy box was definitely located by the crew. He kept firing tracers. He kept pointing. The blood ran and the pain roared through his body, and his hand stayed on the submachine gun, and his eyes stayed on the pillbox. Then the second bullet found him. This one did not hit his chest. It hit his face, and it took his left eye. The citation reads, at this point, he again was wounded by small arms fire, losing his left eye and falling to the ground. Jesse Drowley fell from the engine deck of the Stuart tank and hit the jungle floor. The world went dark on his left side, permanently. The pain must have been beyond description. The shock alone should have rendered him unconscious. But he did not leave. Lying on the wet earth, one eye gone, a bullet hole in his chest. Blood pouring from his face. Jesse Ray Drowley stayed beside that tank. He remained on the ground next to the tracks, close enough to feel the vibration of the engine through the soil, while the crew inside used the targeting information he had given them to pour fire into the pillbox. The bunker was destroyed, completely demolished. And then the tank crew discovered a second pillbox immediately behind the first, hidden in its shadow, and destroyed that one too. 2 fortified positions, both obliterated, both found by a man who had no orders to be there. From somewhere inside the hornet's nest, Lieutenant Murakami witnessed the fire consuming his forward positions. The pillbox that had been raking the American flank was burning. The backup position behind it was burning too. 2 links in his carefully constructed chain of interlocking defenses, broken not by artillery or air power or overwhelming numbers, but by fire delivered with precision. And the precision had come from one man, a single American soldier who had sat on top of a tank in the open, absorbing bullets, losing an eye, and still pointing his tracers at the target until the job was done. Murakami had believed his system was unbreakable. He had believed that the Americans lacked the means to reach inside his bunkers and kill the men within. He had been wrong. Not about the weapon. The flamethrower tanks were crude and limited and ran out of fuel in 20 seconds. He had been wrong about the men. About the kind of man who would climb onto the exposed deck of a tank under direct fire and refuse to come down until the enemy was destroyed. That was the variable his engineering could not account for. The citation for the Medal of Honor concludes with a single sentence that says everything. Staff Sergeant Drowley, his voluntary mission successfully accomplished, returned alone for medical treatment. Voluntary mission. No one ordered him. Successfully accomplished. 2 pillboxes destroyed, dozens of lives saved. Returned alone. No stretcher, no medic, nobody with an arm under his shoulder. One eye, a hole in his chest. Blood covering half his face and soaking through his torn uniform from collar to belt. Jesse Drowley stood up from the jungle floor and walked back toward the American perimeter by himself. He did not wait for a stretcher team. He did not call for help. He placed one boot in front of the other, the same way he had walked to the sawmill every morning in Michigan, the same way he had walked onto the transport ship that carried him across the Pacific, the same way he had walked into Guadalcanal and Mount Austin, and every terrible place the war had taken him. Behind him, the pillboxes burned. The fire he had called down upon them rose in black columns through the jungle canopy, visible for hundreds of yards. When he reached the aid station, a young officer was waiting. Not waiting for Drowley specifically. Waiting the way rear echelon officers wait while the men at the front do the bleeding. This officer saw a soldier from Company B, a unit that had been ordered to hold the defensive perimeter and serve as a reserve. A unit that was not part of the assault. A soldier who had no business being anywhere near the hornet's nest. The officer looked at the bleeding man and spoke. "You abandoned your post. I could have you court-martialed. Think about that for a moment." A 24-year-old staff sergeant has just rescued 2 wounded men under fire, discovered a hidden enemy position that the entire assault force missed, climbed onto a tank, guided it to the target using tracer rounds while completely exposed, taken a bullet through the chest, taken a second bullet that destroyed his left eye, remained beside the tank until 2 pillboxes were demolished, and then walked back to the American lines alone. And the first words he hears are not "thank you," not "well done," not "let me get you a medic." The first words are a threat of punishment for leaving a position he was ordered to hold. This is not a failure of the military. This is the nature of systems. Systems run on rules, and rules do not have eyes. The young officer saw a violation. He could not see the reason behind it because the reason was bleeding out of the man standing in front of him. It took time for the truth to surface. It took witness statements and after-action reports and the slow grinding machinery of military bureaucracy to piece together what Jesse Drowley had actually done on the morning of January the 30th. When the truth became clear, the conversation changed. Instead of a court-martial, Drowley was recommended for the highest military honor the United States of America can bestow upon a member of its armed forces: the Medal of Honor. But the battle was not finished when Drowley walked away from it. By midday, the flamethrower tanks had exhausted their fuel and needed to return to the rear area to refill and repressurize. Each round trip took 20 to 30 minutes, and during that time, the infantry had to hold its ground without flame support. At approximately 13:30 hours, 5 M3A1. Stuart light tanks rolled back to the front line and rejoined the assault. This time, the coordination was better. The lessons of the morning paid for in blood and confusion, and the deaths of good men had seeped into the bones of the soldiers still fighting. The tanks advanced. The infantry followed. The pattern repeated itself across the afternoon. A tank would approach a bunker and unleash its fire, the burning fuel pouring through the narrow firing slits and filling the interior with unbearable heat and choking smoke. Behind the tank, a demolition team would rush forward with TNT charges and satchel explosives to finish whatever the flame had started. Then the line would push forward another 20 yards, and the process would begin again with the next bunker. By the time the sun began to drop toward the western Pacific, the hornet's nest had been broken. 28 large bunkers were destroyed in a single day of fighting. 14 of them, exactly half, were credited directly to the flamethrower tanks. 4 fell to infantry action alone. 1 was knocked out by 81mm mortar fire. The remainder were destroyed by a combination of tank cannon fire and infantry assault. The number that mattered most was 14. More than half the bunkers in the most formidable defensive position the Americans had encountered on Bougainville had been eliminated by a weapon that 2 months earlier had been nothing more than a crude improvisation on a distant island. American casualties for the day were significant. Company C of the 132nd Infantry lost 1 officer and 10 enlisted men killed, with another officer and 13 men wounded. The 754th Tank Battalion lost 2 men killed in the friendly fire incident at the start of the assault, with 14 more wounded or injured during the course of the day. In addition, Colonel James Greer and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Matheson, 2 of the most senior officers on the battlefield, were dead. The infantry troops engaged in the fighting received 5 Silver Stars and 2 Bronze Stars for their actions. Tank crewmen received 2 more Silver Stars, and 1 man, a staff sergeant from Company B, who had no orders to be there, would receive the Medal of Honor. On the Japanese side, approximately 80 defenders were killed outside the bunkers, caught in the open while attempting to resist or flee. An estimated 120 to 180 more died inside the bunkers themselves, trapped by the very walls that were supposed to protect them when fire poured through the slits and consumed the oxygen within. The 6th and 7th Companies of the 2nd Battalion 4th South Seas Garrison, the units that had built and defended the Hornet's Nest, were effectively destroyed. The after-action report of the 754th Tank Battalion recorded a conclusion that would have seemed unthinkable to many senior officers just weeks earlier. The action proved conclusively that the tank and infantry team could be used to excellent advantage in jungle terrain. Before the hornet's nest, many commanders believed that the dense tropical jungle of the Pacific was simply too thick for armor to operate effectively. After the hornet's nest, no one made that argument again. What happened on the morning of January the 30th did not stay on Bougainville. It rippled outward across the Pacific theater like a stone dropped into still water, changing everything it touched. The first lesson was communication. Jesse Drowley had been forced to climb onto the deck of a tank and bang on the turret with the butt of his rifle because there was literally no other way for the infantry to talk to the tank crew. The infantry radios operated on AM frequencies. The tank radios operated on FM. The two systems could not communicate directly. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potentially fatal design flaw that turned every combined arms operation into a guessing game. Drowley's desperate act exposed the problem in the most visceral way possible. A man had to ride on the top of a tank in a hailstorm of enemy fire because nobody had thought to give the riflemen and the tankers a shared radio frequency. The solution came quickly. Engineers mounted field telephones on the exterior of tanks wired directly into the crew's internal communication system. An infantryman outside the tank could pick up the handset, press a button, and speak directly to the crew inside. No climbing, no banging, no riding in the open. This system was deployed during the Battle of the Perimeter in March of 1944, just 2 months after the Hornet's Nest on the very same island of Bougainville. It became standard equipment across the Pacific theater and remained in use through the Korean War and beyond. Every time a soldier picked up an external tank phone and told the crew inside where to aim, the echo of Jesse Drowley banging his rifle on a turret hatch was somewhere in the background. The second lesson was fire. The improvised flamethrower tanks on Bougainville had proven far more effective than man-portable flamethrowers, but they were still crude. What they needed was a purpose-built weapon, not a field expedient bolted together from spare parts. In Hawaii, the Chemical Warfare Service of the Pacific Operations Area began a systematic program to create exactly that. Engineers adapted the Canadian Ronson flamethrower to the turrets of M3A1 Stuart light tanks, producing a weapon that was more powerful, more reliable, and carried significantly more fuel than the Bougainville improvisation. The tanks could reach targets at 40 to 50 yards instead of 20. The ignition system was designed from the ground up for reliability rather than improvised from a portable weapon that was never meant to be mounted in a vehicle. These new flamethrower tanks were given a name that suited their terrifying purpose. They called them Satans. The Satan tanks saw their combat debut in the summer of 1944 on the islands of Saipan and Guam. There, the war had changed. The Japanese were no longer building bunkers from coconut logs and jungle hardwood. They were carving fighting positions directly into volcanic rock and coral limestone. These were fortifications that artillery and bombs could barely scratch. But fire still found its way inside, through cracks in the rock, through ventilation shafts, through the narrow openings where machine gun barrels protruded. The Satans burned the defenders out of positions that no other weapon could reach. From the Satans, the evolution continued. The Naval Construction Battalions, the Seabees working at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, took on the task of converting tanks in industrial quantities. They modified nearly 400 tanks into flamethrower vehicles for the Army and the Marine Corps. Each generation was more capable than the last. More fuel, more range, or more reliability. These weapons set the standard for the United States military through the Korean War. It was not until 1955 that a superior flamethrower tank replaced the Sherman-based designs that the Seabees had created. The ultimate test came at Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945. 13 months after the Hornet's Nest. On that small volcanic island, the Japanese had carved 11 miles of interconnecting tunnels into the solid rock. The surface fortifications were immune to naval bombardment and aerial bombing. Man-portable flamethrowers were used extensively, but the operators suffered casualty rates of up to 92%. 92 out of every 100 men who carried a portable flamethrower into battle on Iwo Jima were killed or wounded. The Marine divisions had only 4 flamethrower tanks per tank battalion, but the demand became so intense that infantry units would halt their advance and wait for a flame tank to become available rather than press forward without one. All of it, every Satan tank on Saipan, every CB modification in Hawaii, every flame tank that rolled across the black sand of Iwo Jima traced its lineage back to a crude experiment on New Caledonia and a single morning on Bougainville, where a 24-year-old sawmill worker from Michigan sat on top of a tank and pointed tracer fire at a bunker until the bullets took his eye, and he still would not stop. Jesse Drowley never bragged about what he did. He lived quietly and died with dignity. If you believe stories like his deserve to be told, hit that like button and share this video. And stay with us, because what happened when he walked back into that American camp will change how you see heroism forever. From Bougainville, Jesse Drowley was evacuated first to a field hospital, then transported to San Francisco, and finally transferred to Baxter General Hospital in Spokane, Washington. There, Army surgeons attempted to reconstruct the damage that 2 Japanese bullets had inflicted on a January morning in the Solomon Islands. 7 operations. 7 times on the surgical table while doctors worked to rebuild what the war had torn apart. The left eye socket would remain empty for the rest of his life. The scars on his face would never fully fade. It was at Baxter Hospital that Jesse met Kathleen McAvoy. She was 20 years old, a volunteer who came to the hospital to help however she could. She did not know who he was when they first met, did not know about the hornet's nest or the tank or the pillbox. She saw only a young man with one eye and a quiet manner who endured each surgery with the same patience he had brought to every other hardship in his life. The patience of a sawmill worker's son. The patience of a man who finished what he started. They were married on May the 13th, 1944. He had not yet finished healing. He had not yet received his Medal of Honor. He simply knew the way men like Jesse Drowley knew things without fanfare or dramatic declarations that this was the woman he would spend his life with. And so they began. That summer, Drowley received orders to report to the White House. He and Kathleen traveled to Washington, D.C., newly married, still adjusting to a life that was half battlefield and half beginning. On September the 6th, 1944, on the south lawn of the White House, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt presented the Medal of Honor to 6 servicemen. Jesse Drowley was among them. He was the only soldier of the American Division to receive the Medal of Honor for actions in World War II. The only one out of every man who served in that storied division across every island and every campaign in the Pacific. Roosevelt, who had been born on January the 30th, 1882, leaned forward during the ceremony and made a remark that connected the 2 men in a way that neither could have anticipated. He noted that Drowley's act of heroism had taken place on the president's birthday, January the 30th. The day Jesse Drowley lost his left eye was the same day Franklin Roosevelt had come into the world 62 years earlier. It was a small coincidence, the kind of detail that could be dismissed as meaningless. But Roosevelt, who understood the power of human moments better than almost any man alive, did not dismiss it. He mentioned it. And in mentioning it, he bound the story of a president and a sawmill worker together in a way that neither man's life alone could have accomplished. After the ceremony, Drowley was offered a commission as an officer. He declined. He was invited to speak at war bond rallies across the country, to stand on stages and tell his story to crowds who would cheer and weep and buy bonds. He declined that too. He had done what the moment asked. The moment was over. He wanted to go home. Jesse Drowley was discharged from the United States Army on December the 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor. Along with the Medal of Honor, he had been awarded the Purple Heart with oak leaf clusters, recognizing that he had been wounded in combat on more than one occasion, and 2 Bronze Star medals. He returned to Spokane, not to Michigan, where he had been born and raised, where his father's sawmill still smelled of wet oak. To Spokane, the city where he had met Kathleen, the city where they would build their life. He opened a small gas station called the M&D Garage. The kind of filling station you can picture if you have ever driven through the American Northwest. 2 pumps out front, a repair bay in back, a man in coveralls wiping his hands on a rag and asking what he can do for you. After the gas station, he sold farm equipment for WW2I Case, the company that made the red tractors you saw on every ranch and farm, from eastern Washington to the Idaho Panhandle. Then he worked for the Bonneville Power Administration until December of 1963. And finally, he found the job that suited him best. Heavy equipment mechanic and welder at Fairchild Air Force Base just outside Spokane. The hands that had gripped a submachine gun on top of a burning tank in the Solomon Islands now maintained aircraft and military machinery. He was promoted to equipment maintenance foreman and retired in 1980. He and Kathleen raised 2 sons, Michael and Timothy. They were active in the Medal of Honor Society, Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 1474, the American Division Veterans Association, and the Disabled American Veterans. Jesse was invited to several presidential inaugurations as an honored guest. He attended. He shook hands. He said little. His friends in Spokane described him the same way. Quiet with dignity. Those were the words they used. He liked to fish. He liked to sit with friends and talk not about the war, but about the kinds of things men talk about when they have known each other long enough that silence is as comfortable as conversation. He never bragged. He never told his story unless someone asked, and even then, he kept it short. In 1991, nearly half a century after Bougainville, a reporter from the Spokesman Review newspaper in Spokane sat down with Jesse Drowley for an interview. He was 72 years old by then. One eye, the scars still visible on his face softened by decades but never gone. His voice was calm. When the reporter asked him about the Medal of Honor, about what he had done to earn the highest military decoration in the United States, Jesse Drowley said something that deserves to be heard exactly as he said it. People say, "What did you do to get the Medal of Honor?" You are only doing your job. You are fearless, all right. You are so damn scared you are past fearless. But you are going to get killed if you do not do anything. Let that settle. Do not rush past it. Listen to what he is saying. He is not claiming courage. He is describing a place beyond courage, a place where the fear is so total and so overwhelming that it wraps all the way around and becomes something else. Something that looks like bravery from the outside, but feels like survival from the inside. You are so scared you are past fearless. And in that place, the only rational choice is to act, because standing still means dying. That is not a Hollywood line. That is a sawmill worker from Michigan, telling the truth about war in the plainest language he knows. Jesse Ray Drowley died on May the 20th, 1996 in Spokane. He was 76 years old. He was buried at Fairmount Memorial Park. Kathleen followed him in 2007. They rest near each other in the soil of the city they chose together, far from the jungles where the story began. On Veterans Day, November the 11th, 2014, 18 years after Jesse's death, a memorial monument was dedicated at Fairmount Memorial Park. Friends gathered. Family came. Veterans stood in their old caps and jackets, some leaning on canes, some standing straight despite the years. Jesse's grandchildren stepped forward and pulled the cloth from the stone. Beneath it was his name, his rank, and the dates. A brief account of what happened on January the 30th, 1944. The stone does not tell the whole story. It does not describe the night before the battle when he sat in his foxhole cleaning his garand. It does not mention Mac McBride or the sentence that echoed through every decision Drowley made that morning. It does not capture the sound of the friendly fire shell hitting the lead tank or the sight of Joe Simon running back toward the burning wreckage to save his crew. It does not convey the weight of dragging 2 wounded men across open ground under Japanese fire, or the moment he spotted the hidden pillbox that everyone else had missed. It cannot reproduce the metallic clang of a rifle butt hammering on a turret hatch, or the bright orange lines of tracer cutting through humid air, or the feeling of a bullet entering a man's chest and the decision to keep going anyway. It says nothing about losing an eye and staying beside the tank until the job was done. But the people standing around that stone on Veterans Day in 2014, many of them veterans themselves, many of them men who understood war not from movies, but from memory they knew. They looked at the name Jesse Ray Drowley carved into the granite, and they saw not a hero in the way the word is used in speeches and on posters. They saw something quieter than that. They saw a man who did his job. A man who was so scared he went past fearless. A man who walked back to the aid station alone with one eye and a hole in his chest and got threatened with the court-martial for his trouble. And now you know the rest of that story. You know what the young officer at the aid station did not know. You know why that bleeding, half-blind soldier had left his post. You know about the 2 pillboxes and the tracer rounds and the 20 feet of ground between the tank and the enemy, where everything that mattered happened in the space of a few minutes. You know about the weapon that was born in desperation and became doctrine. You know about the 400 tanks that followed, and the islands that burned, and the war that turned. So, let us go back one final time to that trail through the jungle. Bougainville, January the 30th, 1944. Just past noon. A young American soldier is walking. He is 24 years old. His uniform is ruined. His chest is bleeding. His left eye is gone. He walks alone through the steaming green of a Pacific island the way his father walked to the sawmill every morning in Michigan. When he reaches the aid station, a young officer looks at him with hard eyes. You abandoned your post. But he did not abandon anything. He did not leave his duty behind. He carried it with him onto the deck of that tank and held it in his hands when he fired those tracers and kept it pressed against his chest when the bullets found him. He did not abandon his post. He answered a higher call. The call that every soldier hears when the plan falls apart and the rules no longer fit the moment, and the only thing left is the question of what kind of man you are. Jesse Ray Drowley was the son of a sawmill worker. He was a squad leader who disobeyed a direct order. He was a Medal of Honor recipient who never bragged. He was a gas station owner and a farm equipment salesman and a mechanic at Fairchild Air Force Base. He was a husband, a father, a fisherman, a man his friends called quiet with dignity. And on one morning in the Solomon Islands, when everything went wrong and the dying would not stop, and somebody needed to act, he was the man who did what the moment asked. A man does what the moment asks, or he don't do nothing at all.